right now is destroying communities right now, is leaving us in a very precarious position as we hand over our homes and our communities and our heritage to our kids and the generations that follow. Those same scientists who tell us that the droughts that we are experiencing, the storms that we are seeing, the wildfires that are raging are connected to what we emit and pollute into this planet. They also tell us that if we fail to take action now, the consequences will be even more dire and more severe. And it will claim even more lives of our fellow human beings and our fellow Americans. Those scientists tell us that we have no more than 12 years left to us to make sure.
Check. Or do you want to just take him?
Every single country on this planet does its part to meet this challenge and ensure that this globe does not warm another degree Celsius, after which we will never have
Check.
opportunity to save those lives that will otherwise be lost. This is the moment
Yeah, I got you.
for the leadership of the indispensable country, the only one that can pull this. That can make that happen is our democracy. This right now, right here in Burlington, is democracy in action. This is you allowing me to introduce myself. This is me now turning the floor over to you and listening to what's on your mind, answering your questions, hearing the solutions you pose to the questions that we are all asking ourselves. Lastly, I've already learned a lot today in this first day of our candidacy for president. Before this, I was in Fort Madison with the Bloodhounds, meeting with one of your own, Mr. King, who teaches the welding class in that high school, who taught here in Burlington and also taught at the Burlington Community College. When we were talking about the future of work and ensuring that this economy works for everyone, when we pointed out that there's $1.5 trillion in outstanding student loan debt in this country that is crushing our fellow Americans, that cost is too much of an object for too many to get that education that they need to be able to get ahead, he said, Beto, let me show you something. And he introduced me to the kids in that welding workshop, all of whom will have earned by the time they're 18 the first year in a 2-year credit program to get a certification as a welder. Thanks to the counselors at that high school, they'll be able to come to Burlington Community College and finish that second year debt-free, and upon graduation be able to command starting wages of $30 an hour. In other words, when we listen to and respect one another, there's nothing that we can't do. There is so much for us to learn, and I see the future of America right here, right now. Thank you for allowing me to be here with you. Very, very thankful. All right. If you've got a question, if you've got a comment, if you've got a suggestion, if you have some guidance or advice, I am all ears and ready to respond. Yes, ma'am.
I have 2 small daughters, so I was wondering, do you have a plan to combat human trafficking?
Great question. Questions about human trafficking, which sometimes we think is limited to the U.S.-Mexico border, and it is a problem there. We need to make sure that we train our resources effectively to combat that and illegal drug trafficking. But human trafficking is also a problem within our cities. Sometimes it starts in our hometowns, sometimes it's taking place in a neighbor's home. We need to make sure we protect the lives of every single one of us, that we invest the resources in local law enforcement, including the training, so that they know what to look for, to free people from this kind of captivity and the bleak future that you've just described in your question. I want to make sure that we're listening to local communities as they show us how we can do that. Thank you for asking the question. Yes, sir.
I have a sister with autism, and mental health is a big issue here in rural Iowa. So do you have a plan to help strengthen our mental health care facilities here in rural areas of our country?
Question is about mental health specifically in rural parts of the country. In Texas, the largest provider of mental health care services is the county jail system.
Right.
And so people with schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, depression, Even in some cases, veterans returning from service in Afghanistan and Iraq, post-traumatic stress disorder, the consequences of traumatic brain injury and military sexual trauma, are on the streets getting arrested on purpose because it is the only way they are guaranteed to get the care that they need. In Texas, it's $110 a night to feed, to clothe, to house, to medicate, to provide some temporary access to a clinician before you're back out on the streets. For a fraction of the cost, we can invest in guaranteed, high-quality, universal health care, including mental health care, including ensuring every single woman is able to make her own decisions about her own body, and not only is it good for those who are doing without today, who are suffering, who in some instances are claiming their own lives in a country that lost more than 150,000 people last year to drug overdose and suicide. Not only is it good for them and their families, it's great for all of us, because when you are well enough to live to your full promise and potential, the benefit of that is enjoyed by everybody here. That song that you write, that piece of art that you create, that class that you teach, that job that you fill, that cup of coffee that you pour right here, that's going to make our lives better as a result. So investing in people is investing in all of us, and we absolutely need to make an investment in mental health care.
Tariffs. Can you talk about tariffs? We're in Iowa.
Farmers.
Questions about tariffs. 30% of what we grow in this state is bound for foreign markets all over the world. Now, we are right to hold China accountable for its trade practices, for manipulating the system for their gain at our expense. We are wrong, however, to go into a trade war, or any war for that matter, without allies. By alienating our traditional trade partners and our partners around the world, we go into this war alone, less likely to succeed and to prevail. And who will pay the price at the end of the day? It's the farmer, it's the producer, it is the rancher. In Texas, I met with a pecan grower. Said the tariffs on his pecans that he sold into the rest of the world used to be 2%. Thanks to this trade war and the reciprocal tariffs that are levied on him, it's 27%. No one's buying the pecans grown in Texas. And he says, you know what, Beto, I know at some point this trade war will end, these tariffs will come down, but by then, those buyers in those other countries will have found other producers and sellers in other countries, not the United States. And you know what? My kids, to whom I hope to pass this farm onto, they'll no longer be able to make a profit here. We'll subdivide this land, turn it into housing, and it's gone to us and my family forever. We cannot pay that price. That cannot be the consequence of our trade agreements. We need fair trade, trade that recognizes the value of these farms and producers and what we grow here, but also recognizes the value of manufacturing and the workers who make the things that distinguish this country. I think there's an opportunity to make labor first and foremost in our trade agreements. Climate, right there with it, human rights. Not only is that good for those causes and the things that we believe in, but they will level the playing field for the producer, for the worker, and for this country. We can have good trade agreements that are fair for all concerned. I want to make sure we do that. Thank you for the question. Yes, sir.
I'm a student at Western, and we just had 130 faculty layoffs. What are your plans to help out higher education?
Question is about higher education. Gentleman goes to Western, mentioned a number of layoffs that just took place there. What are we going to do to invest in higher education? As I mentioned earlier, we can begin in high school, making sure that credit hours are earned at no expense and no debt to the student and their family. We can make sure that community colleges are an integral part of higher education, and cost is not an object or a barrier to more Americans being able to get more education. We know beyond the shadow of a doubt that educational attainment is correlated with what you're able to earn and do over the course of your lifetime, what you're able to pass down to your kids. We would be fools not to ensure that every single American can avail themselves of higher education. Now that may be an apprenticeship or a trade, that may be a community college, that may be a traditional four-year university. It's an investment that we'll have to make. It's not inexpensive, but the cost of not making that investment is even greater, and the returns, should we make it now, are so handsome, will ensure so many can enter or stay in or advance from the middle class in this country. So I mentioned earlier, I think we need to make sure that we find a way to help retire the $1.5 trillion in outstanding student loan debt right now, that we connect retiring that debt where we can to public service in underserved communities in in-demand professions that help those who've already served. I think of the VA, which is undermanned, 49,000 positions short today. It means veterans are waiting in line to get the care that they need, 20 a day, taking their lives every single day. 16 of those 20 unable or unwilling for whatever reason to go into the VA. Let's connect your college debt to your willingness to serve those who have served this country, just as one example. And then let's invest in these institutions of higher education, the people who make them run, the faculty, the staff, the professors, so that those students like you have every opportunity in life, because your opportunity by extension is our opportunity as a country. Thanks for the question. Want to come back to this side? Yes, sir. Gentleman in the back.
I'm an attorney, CPA here in town, do taxes. This tax law is horrible.
Yes.
Every time I look at it, it's the most complicated law ever passed since 1913. It makes no sense. It highly favors commercial real estate development. It helps farmers a little bit, but not that much. And it's not doing much. I mean, there's some winners and losers for the regular people. They're telling us this thing is favorable. You know, this is for the middle class. This is only for the middle class. You define middle class as being those make $400,000. That's not my neighborhood.
Right. Imagine our kids reading about the tax cut that was just described in the distant future, or even the not too distant future. They're going to say, okay, let me get this straight. You were fighting 6 different wars around the world. You had a debt of $21 trillion. You had deficits adding to that debt of almost and now $1 trillion a year. You had millions of Americans who couldn't get health care. You have teachers working 2 jobs. You have folks who cannot afford to go to college. And your answer to that was to cut a $2 trillion tax cut to the very wealthiest and the corporations who are already sitting on record piles of cash right now. They will not be able to believe it. In El Paso, we know that those kids will ask, who were those pendejos in 2017 and 2018? We don't want to be those pendejos. We want to be those who make this fair and make this right for every single one of us. Who make sure that those who are struggling, working the lowest wage jobs, some of the most important jobs in the country, get help getting up and lifting their kids up. We want to make sure that education is favored in that tax code. We do not want to make sure that those who make their income from capital alone are favored at a rate far better than any one of us who do not. So there's a way to do this, and it begins by listening to everyone around this country. It begins by acknowledging that some of the things that we're talking about, investing in higher education, investing in the technology necessary to meet the challenge of climate change, investing in things like the Clean Power Plan and clean vehicle emission standards that make our air cleaner and allow us to have a future for our kids, that there's some cost involved in that. But if you're like me, you're willing to bear any burden, make any sacrifice if it's going to make this a better country for the generations that come. Our tax code today does not do that. Thank you for asking the question. Yes, sir.
Yeah, the Supreme Court going from
And I'm gonna ask you.
from 9 people to 15, have been banners around, make it less political. There is a thing out there where 5 Republicans, big 5 Republicans, 5 Democrats, and then the 10 justices that are there have to unanimously pick the next one to take politics out of it. First of all, I know it's going to be hard to get 10 of them to agree to anything. Still, it's broken. What's your idea of fixing it?
This question is about the Supreme Court and whether we should entertain the idea of changing its composition and perhaps its character. There's nothing in the Constitution that defines how many people should sit on that court, the most important court, a co-equal branch, and one that will decide the future, whether it's women's health care, whether it's corporate personhood, whether it's who can participate and buy into this democracy, not just for us, but for our kids and our grandkids. And given the fact that we are at one of the most dysfunctional points in U.S. governmental history, I think it calls upon us to be creative about what some of the solutions are. Otherwise, we wouldn't think about one of the proposals the gentleman just raised. What if there were 5 justices selected by Democrats, 5 justices selected by Republicans, and those 10 then pick 5 more justices independent of those who chose the first 10? I think that's an idea that we should explore. There's another idea of having term limits on those justices so that there's a more regular rotation through there. We're a country of 320 million people. There's got to be the talent, the wisdom, and the perspective, and that court should be able to reflect the diversity that we are composed of in this country. I think that is an idea worth exploring as well. But regardless of what it is, we've got to make sure that this very divided, highly polarized country is able to come together. We find enough common ground to pursue the common good, that we all have a common conception of who we are as Americans before we're Republicans and Democrats. I've never, in my 46 years on the planet, seen anything like this in the level of division, and those older than I am say it's the same in their lifetimes as well. I think we have to do this in the spirit of true compromise. It cannot be an imposed solution, nor do I think that's possible even if we wanted it to be. So I think this conversation should certainly happen, and it shouldn't be to the advantage of any one party, but to the advantage of the country. Thanks for asking the question. I promised you would get the next question.
Currently in our country, you're more likely to spend more time in federal prison for nonviolent drug offenses than you are for abusing or sexually assaulting a woman or child. I want to know how you feel, like how you're going to address that, because it's a huge problem, I think, for me. I feel like how much time is worth more than me giving my life.
Whoa.
And I know it's not fair.
Yeah. Really, really good question. I hope to do it justice in repeating the question. Why do we put people behind bars for more years for having possession of marijuana, a substance that is, by the way, legal in one form or another in more than half the states in the Union? Why are they serving longer sentences than those who abuse women and children in this country? And if I were to take the spirit of the question into justice reform and sentencing reform, why is a woman in Texas who erroneously voted an election serving 5 years, and Paul Manafort, who sought to corrupt and bring down our democracy, is going to serve less time, at least in the first sentence? We have the terrible distinction of putting more of our own behind bars than any other country on the planet. We know that so many of them are there for nonviolent drug offenses, and though all Americans of all races and ethnicities use illegal drugs at the same rate, disproportionately, African Americans, Mexican Americans, people of color in this country will be arrested, will spend time behind bars, and will be forced to check a box upon release before they apply for any job saying that they have a conviction, almost guaranteeing that they will not get the job that they seek, consigned to a life of poverty and narrowed options. It comes at extraordinary expense to the potential of this country, to the earning power of those men and women, and we have a real opportunity in real justice reform that acknowledges the inequity of the system that we have today and that fails to prioritize the crimes that we seek to deter, like using violence against somebody in your life, against a small child, against a woman. So let's use this bipartisan moment. There are voices on both sides of the aisle right now who are talking about this, and make the absolute most of it. If we do, I think our country more fully realizes her potential. Thank you for asking the question. Appreciate it. Yes, sir. Okay, we have time for 2 more.
I used to be a machinist until recently. Siemens closed our turbine manufacturing plant here in Burlington, Iowa. They're shipping our jobs to Paramount, India, and Brno in the Czech Republic. Siemens is a huge federal contractor. They've got tons of federal subsidies. They've got $765 million in federal contracts under the Trump administration. What would you be willing to do to try to save American jobs and keep them here?
Yeah. The question is about how we save American jobs, and perhaps specifically American jobs that are tied to large corporations who have benefited from the public investments that we have all made in their success. I think the answer is probably going to be in communities like this one, where you share with people like me how we can partner to keep those jobs here and grow the number of jobs here. I alluded earlier to the importance of education, to having the trained workforce. Mr. King, to whom I referred earlier at Fort Madison High School, he said 4 of his students were just hired by Santa Fe, and Santa Fe has more positions available. They just cannot find the trained workforce. So if it's Santa Fe or Siemens, let's make sure that talent is never a reason for them to ship jobs overseas, and that we invest in the education of those who are going to work there. Let's also make sure that, to the question that the gentleman posed earlier about the tax code, that there are real consequences for shipping jobs overseas. If all of us pay taxes to invest in the infrastructure, the education, the training, the opportunity for these corporations in the first place, they have a public responsibility, given the investment that we've made in them, to return that investment by focusing on these communities. So I want to make sure that that's expressed there as well. And Senator, did you have something that you wanted to add on this specific?
No, I have one more question.
So sir, let me ask you, just to finish this out, give me your best ideas for how we do this.
Well, I don't know if this could be through legislation, to keep a company like that, a big foreign company, come in and buy an American company. We've been in business since 1817. They came in, they bought us, they stole our intellectual property, our manufacturing processes we've developed over decades, and they're taking them overseas, and it's not fair. Would legislation be an option?
So I think this comes back to some of our conversation about trade. There have to be real consequences and real accountability for those who game the international trading system and who game the economy of the United States of America. I think that's an appropriate role for the president to show leadership and for there to be consequences for these large corporations who are doing what you just described. Again, would look to you and to others to help describe what that looks like, whether it's legislation, whether it's leadership from the White House in negotiating these trade relationships.
Okay, well, executive order be an option. Trump likes to do executive orders. Would that be our jobs here? I mean, those jobs are gone. They're not coming back.
If it's the most effective way to do it, the answer is yes.
Okay,
Absolutely.
I just worry about my coworkers.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
There are two things. Number one, what Bob Robert was talking about. Those jobs are leaving this country because of cheap labor. I think we should pass some kind of legislation to stop this cheap labor. That's the only reason they're leaving. They're not leaving for quality or anything else. They're leaving because the labor is cheaper there. I think legislation that some countries have used content legislation. If we can do something like that, it's got to be made here if you sell it here. I think that would do a lot to straighten out the problem that Robert's talking about. The other real question I had was, we're going to see a lot of candidates here in Burlington, Bendo, I'm sorry. I had a lot of trouble with that. What rises you to the top of the other candidates? You know them. What will make us want you to be the next president over them?
Okay, two things really quickly, just to conclude my contribution to this trade discussion. To your point, in Ciudad Juarez, our sister city, we have these maquilas, these factories that contain jobs that used to exist here in the United States. Some of those workers in those maquilas are making $40 a week. Now, in many cases, they're shopping at the same supermarket that Amy and I are in El Paso. We're truly a binational, connected community. In Mexico, they do not have the right to organize. They cannot use the leverage of the value that they provide in those maquilas to exact better wages and working conditions. And by extension, not only does that make life worse for them, it puts us at a competitive disadvantage in the U.S. So we are right to insist upon labor standards in any of our negotiations so that those jobs are not shipped overseas. What makes me different was the question. I don't know how to compare or contrast myself to other candidates. All I can tell you is who I am. Lifelong El Pasoan, born and raised in the same community my parents were born and raised in. Now with Amy, I'm there to help raise our kids. Ulysses, who's 12, Molly, who's 10, Henry, who's 8 years old, going to the same world-class public schools that I was lucky enough to go in when I was a kid. Small business owner. Started a high-wage, high-skill, high-tech business in El Paso. Employed my fellow El Pasoans in jobs that we otherwise would not have been able to find. Worked in city council, served in Congress. In the minority, every one of the 6 years that I was there, I always found a way to find a partner on the other side of the aisle to get it done. People like you in my hometown, were I to come back and say, you know what, those Republicans are standing in the way of being able to ensure that veterans get access to mental health care, they'd call BS on me, as they should. They'd say, Beto, find a way to get it done. Holding town hall meetings every single month, reminding myself to whom I'm accountable and who it is I serve, made me a better representative and ensured that I found that Republican colleague to get mental health care legislation for veterans across the line, to work even with the Trump administration, with whom I agree on almost nothing. Let us not allow... Let us not allow our differences to define us at this moment. History calls for us to come together, to show ourselves, our fellow Americans, the generations that follow, what we are made of and what we can do. And the only way to get that done is to get it done together. Thank you all for having me out here today.